Hi, my name is Bala Paranj and I work for a company called InterIdea located in Washington, D.C., a Ruby on Rails consulting company. And in this screencast, I'll be talking about Ruby blocks, the basics, part one of this series. So let's get started. Maths defines blocks as nameless functions. You can pass a nameless function to another function, and that function can invoke the passed in nameless function. Blocks are powerful because you can customize a method by passing in a block. When I came across blocks in Ruby, it seemed like template pattern from the Gang of Four book. So what is a block? A block is some Ruby code enclosed in curly brackets. So let's say my block equals something like this. So what happens when I run this? I get a compile error. You cannot just assign a block to a variable. It gives a compiler because it's a valid Ruby syntax only when it's an argument to a method call. We can use the lambda method in the kernel module. So if you just say lambda and run this is a valid syntax. So when we pass the block as the argument to the lambda method, it returns as a proc object. We look at proc object in more detail later. So let's try, once we assign this to a block, let's call that block by doing my block.call. Since you didn't pass any parameter, it blows, so you need to pass in, let's say, Ruby way. This block X here expects a variable to be passed into the block. So if it is 2, then I need to pass 2 when I call the block. So when I run this now, it prints Ruby way. So let's see, let's print the class of this block. It's a proc object. As you can see, it's a proc object, and you can call the call method in the proc object to execute the chunk of code. And this block can contain any logic. So now let's look at the difference between proc versus lambda. So I'll create lambda version. You can create a block using either proc or lambda. So there are two different ways, and we'll now see the difference between them. In this block, it takes two block arguments, x and y, and I just find the difference between these two and return that as a result. So when I call this, so what happens if I just pass in 1? I don't match the number of expected block arguments by the block. If I run this, sub lambda.call, and if I run this, I get wrong number of arguments. 1 for 2. It's expecting 2, but I passed in only 1. So what happens if I give more arguments than it's expecting? It again says wrong number of arguments, 3 for 2. So if you use lambda, you need to give the exact number of arguments. Otherwise, you'll get an error message. So you can put the value of the resulting thing. It's -1. 2 minus 3 is -1, -1. So when you create block objects using lambda, it behaves like Ruby methods. When you don't pass the right number of arguments, you can't call the block. Let's now see what happens if you have block argument using procs. So I create sub proc new proc new. When I call this with just one argument, you get nil can be coerced into fixed num. So it expects 2 arguments, but since you didn't give a value for the second argument, it automatically assigns nil. And it's keep blowing up because nil can be forced into fixed num. So what happens when you give more than what it's expecting? 4, 3, and then let's say 5, 45. And it doesn't give any error message, and the result is 4 minus 3, which is 1. It just ignores the extra argument if you pass an extra argument. So that's the difference between proc and the lambda. When you don't pass enough arguments, the missing arguments are given nil values. When too many arguments are passed in, the extra arguments are ignored when you use proc. So how do you write method that accepts block? Blocks are found in other languages, but in Ruby, any method can be called with block. You don't really have to specify explicitly that a function can accept another function as an argument. So you can say def call block twice. And then yield. So I can call block twice, then give a block. So I can see the block gets called twice. So this is a block, is the output from the block. And again, this is a block, is again output from the block. When the yield is called, it invokes the block. So you don't have to declare anything. Notice in this call block twice, you don't specify any arguments that explicitly receives the block. So let's now see multiple yields. Let's see another example. call this twice. If I run this without providing any blocks, it throws an exception. Block is required to call yield multiple times. If block is given, then it executes twice the logic inside the block. So block given is a Ruby built-in function that actually checks if a block was passed into the function. If it is, then it executes n dot times yield. The yield call is very similar to block.call. It basically yields to the block which has been passed, and the control flow goes to the block, and the functionality inside the blocks is getting executed. Now we'll see the difference between yield versus block.call. So here is a simple example. Def foo, and I just have yield, and I call this method foo puts just high. When I run this, I get high. So what happens if I replace this yield with block.call? It says undefined local variable or method block for main object. So you don't have to explicitly declare an argument, but you can, if you want, declare like an argument which is going to be a block. You need to prefix it with an ampersand and do a block.call. Now it will run, it will say hi. But one thing you need to remember, if you use the star variable number of arguments in your method, the block argument has to be the very last argument passed into the method. So let's now see how to get results from a block. Calling block, going to store the result in a variable, yield, pass in some value to the block, and the block argument will get this value first, and then result block is result of the block is, this time it's result 2, and I'll call this method I check if x which is the block argument passed in by doing a yield and then passing in the argument that gets assigned to this block argument x. If x is first, I return 1, otherwise I return 2. So when I run this, you get the calling block, called block call for the first time. First time it got 1 since I was passing in the first as a string, and the second time it got the value of 2. So the second part of the screencast will cover more concepts about blocks, and check back the blog in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.